Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist Ben Gallagher. This is the first one in the ecology playlist. Now, ecology is the study of living things in their environment. It's about how all of those living things interact with each other, but also how they interact with the environment in itself. And what I mean when I say the environment itself, I'm talking about all the non-living aspects of the environment. So things like the weather and things like the terrain. Now, the term for those non-living parts of an environment are the abiotic factors. Biotic means living, abiotic means non-living. It doesn't mean dead, it means the stuff that's never lived. Things like the wind, things like temperature, things like rocks. Those are non-living things, that's abiotic sites. So ecology is basically the study of how the biotic and abiotic parts of an environment all interact together. Now we're going to start with this video on something that should be quite familiar to you, so I'm just going to ease you into this. This is looking at food chains and trophic levels. It's suitable for GCSE level and it should be very, very straightforward. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do so. Thanks. So if we're going to start to consider the feeding relationships within ecology and how all the different creatures interact in terms of what eats what, the first point we should logically start with is, where does the food come from? What's the start point? Now we must consider that one of the main things you get from food is energy, which of course then throws up a question itself of where does that energy come from? Well, the next bit should be really, really obvious because we've covered all this in previous videos. The energy comes from the sun. Okay, the sun is a massive, massive ball of burning gas. It's like a nuclear reactor sitting out in space, throwing out all this energy into space, and a very small amount of that energy will hit Earth. But even so, how does that energy get converted into food? Again, you ought to remember this. This is about photosynthesis done by plants. Okay, so plants can lock up sunlight energy in the sugar that they produce. They're literally kind of caging that energy inside a molecule. Now you should remember that that sugar is glucose and that that's the main source of energy for almost all other life on the planet. So let's quickly recap. How does the photosynthesis trap the sunlight? Well, remember, it's a chemical reaction. That sunlight energy is going to be converted or going to be trapped inside a glucose molecule. That glucose molecule, remember, is like a trap for the energy, but to build it requires a catalyst. It won't spontaneously form. So you need this powerful protein catalyst, which is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is found in chloroplasts. It's green in color. It's what makes plants green. That, of course, can trap the energy in the glucose molecule, making glucose act like a cage for sunlight. So we've got to consider what you need for glucose. So you should remember that glucose contains carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, and it's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens, C6H12O6. You need to know that. So where's it getting those carbons, hydrogens and oxygens from? Well, the carbon's going to come from carbon dioxide in the air. The hydrogen is going to come from water. Now both of those molecules contain oxygen. So let's just try and balance things out a bit now. We need 6 carbons for the glucose. So we get those 6 carbons from 6 carbon dioxides. But of course 6 carbon dioxides, each one contains 2 oxygen atoms. So that's 12 oxygens coming from the carbon dioxide. Well, we only need 6 in a glucose. So we've already got a surplus of oxygen. Let's look at the water though. Water gives us 2 hydrogens per water and we need 12. So we need 6 water molecules to give us our 12 hydrogens. But again, they carry extra oxygen as well. Each water has 1 oxygen. Well, we said we got 12 oxygens from the carbon dioxide, 6 more from the waters. That's 18 oxygens. So we're going to have a lot of oxygen left over because we only needed 6 for our glucose. To be precise, we're going to have 6 molecules of oxygen left over because we put in 18 oxygens, 6 are needed for the glucose. That's 12 that are left over, which is 6 lots of O2. Hopefully that makes sense. If you're totally lost, please go back to the bioenergetics lessons, look at the photosynthesis presentations. But what we've got here is a mechanism for producing glucose. But glucose isn't the only food, but plants use glucose to make the other main food molecules, like amino acids and lipids. They could either directly convert the glucose, shift their molecules around a bit, or they can react the glucose, do respiration with it to create energy and use that energy to help create the other food molecules. So plants can produce other food molecules by using the glucose. Essentially then, food comes from plants. That's its start point. Plants are producers of that food. They produce the food. There's a reason why I'm stressing that word, and we'll come to it next. So let's actually look at the food chains now, and let's put that last slide in context. We've just said that plants produce pretty much all the food for the planet. So if we put the first level there as producers, we're essentially talking about plants. There are a couple of exceptions of the base of a food chain being things other than plants that produce food in ways other than photosynthesis, but they're very, very rare. So we're not going to worry about them. I want you to be basing your understanding that producers are producing food by photosynthesis. So producer is our bottom layer of our food chain. The next layer that comes along is a primary consumer. Primary meaning first, consumer meaning eating. Okay, so primary consumer, the first thing that comes along to eat a producer. Primary consumer will be eaten by a secondary consumer, which can then be eaten by a tertiary consumer. Now, those terms that I've got up there are the trophic level, so I've added that to the title. A trophic level just means the level where it is in the feeding chain. Trophic is from an old Latin word. If you think about pigs eat from a trough, okay, a trough from the same word it means for eating. So a trophic level is the eating level that an organism is at. Now, of course, those are just terms at the moment. To make it a chain, we need to link them together, and we link them together with arrows. So have a quick think to yourself, are you going to put arrows going in that direction or in that direction? Hopefully you've realized the arrows go in that direction, because the arrows represent energy. The arrow shows where the energy goes. That's a really simple little rhyme that I give to year 7s, but if it helps you to remember that, that's great. They're representing energy flow. So producer goes into the primary consumer, it's eaten by that. Primary consumer is eaten by the secondary consumer, its energy goes into the secondary consumer and then into the tertiary consumer. Make sure you get your arrows the right way around, please. So let's look at an example of that. And when we're looking at examples, and when you have to create examples, there's 2 really important things I want you to follow. Firstly, keep your food chain examples to one habitat. That just keeps them realistic, so you don't get something like grass being eaten by a rabbit, being eaten by a fox, being eaten by a great white shark. Okay, great white shark, totally different habitat to the other things. It's not going to happen. So keep it to one habitat to keep it realistic. And also try to be species specific about what organism you're talking about. Don't just put fish, because fish could be a great white shark, or it could be a tiny little minnow in a freshwater stream. Okay, fish is a very broad term. Same with things like bird. It could be a huge harpy eagle, massive birds of prey, or it could be a sparrow. So bird doesn't really mean anything. Really try and identify what species you're talking about. But if I look at one example here, and the example I'm going to look at is a shallow sea habitat, it's kind of near a seashore. I'm going to put up the basic food chain here, but I'm going to start to substitute things out. So instead of producer, I'm going to flip that out and I'm going to put algae. Algae is a microscopic single-celled plant, okay? But they come in their millions. So you get big masses of it, like in the picture there. But it's still a plant, so it's still photosynthesizing, it's still producing. Algae can be eaten by a shore crab. So notice again, I'm being species specific, not just eating crab. There's loads of crabs, including something like a coconut crab, which is absolutely enormous, climbs trees and can break open coconuts with its claw. We're not talking about one of those. We're talking about bulk standard shore crabs, which would be the ones you would have seen down at the seaside. Shore crab could be eaten by a common octopus, and that's its species name. This is a common octopus. One of their favourite foods are crabs. They grab hold of them with their tentacles, can break them open and bite at them with a beak underneath. And a common octopus could be eaten by a nurse shark. Again, I'm being specific on what type of shark. So a nurse shark would hunt out in the coral reefs and find a common octopus and eat it. So there's just one example of a food chain. But in note, it follows the 2 key rules. It stays to one habitat and it's species specific. That's what you must do when you're making them. So let's have a look now at how energy moves through these food chains. We've said that the arrows represent the energy, but let's just look at what happens. So if I've got a producer being eaten by a primary consumer, that yellow arrow there is representing the energy that moves on. But let's remember that the producer took in a lot of energy on its own. So I'm just going to add the sun at the start of my food chain here. And I'm going to put that great big yellow arrow showing a huge amount of energy coming to the producer, so the producer can produce a certain quantity of glucose. Okay, that we can think of as kind of that's the 100% that is produced for the rest of the food chain. Now, is all of that glucose and energy that's being produced by the producer going to be passed on to the primary consumer? Well, no, of course it's not, because the producer didn't make it for the primary consumer. The producer made it for itself, and it made it for itself because it wanted that glucose to respire. So a big chunk of that energy that came from the sun that the producer turned into glucose is going to be respired, and the energy that comes out of that glucose is going to be used by the organism. Okay, if it's a producer, it's not going to be using a huge amount of it. It's not like it's running around, it's a plant. Okay, but it is going to be using some of it for moving solutes around, for doing active transport, for growth, for things like that. Okay, so a chunk of that is being used by the organism. Another chunk of it isn't eaten. So the primary consumer isn't going to eat all of the plant. Let's say it's a cow eating grass. It's only eating the top bits of the plant. The roots and everything underneath are still there, and those will contain a huge amount of the glucose. So a lot of it isn't eaten. Thirdly, of the bits that are eaten, not all of it gets properly digested and absorbed by the primary consumer. So it comes straight out the other end of the primary consumer and it is excreted as feces, as poo. Okay, so you've really got these three key areas of that big yellow arrow that came from the sun. So you look at the size of it. You've got a chunk of it that went off because it was respired by the producer. Another chunk of that energy that wasn't eaten at all, so was left behind and then could just decay, and its energies can rot back into the soil and be reused. Or you've got a third one where it was eaten, but it passed straight through the primary consumer. So the only stuff that was passed on, that arrow that's moving between the producer and primary consumer, that's what actually ended up in the primary consumer as usable glucose, usable energy. And look at the size of the arrows. It's a very narrow arrow relative to the big one that originally came in. But of course, the energy that's in the primary consumer will move on into the secondary consumer. And look at the arrow now. It's even thinner because the primary consumer is going to use a lot of its energy for itself. The secondary consumer isn't going to eat all of the primary consumer, and what it does eat, some of it will pass straight through and be excreted at the other end. Same when we get to tertiary consumer, but look how tiny that line is now. So from all of that energy and that big chunky yellow arrow that came down from the sun, all that energy was produced. Only a very, very tiny amount of it ends up going on to the tertiary consumer. So if we consider that as 100%, I put 100% up there, what actually gets passed on to the primary consumer is only about 10%. And because the primary consumer loses in the same three ways, only about 1% goes on into the secondary consumer. And because the secondary consumer loses in lots of ways, only 0.1% ends up in the end. You'll notice it's only 10% each time of the previous one. So 10% of 1% was the 0.1, 10% of 10% was the 1%, and so on. So you're only passing on a very small amount. It's why tertiary consumers are less common. It's why there's fewer of them. They have to be very aggressive in getting their food generally, and they need to eat quite a lot to get the energy that they require, because a lot of the energy is lost as you move along. So because of the decrease in energy, each trophic level must eat a greater quantity of the trophic level before it to get enough food and energy. Quantity of organisms in each trophic level is called the biomass. So we can start to kind of standardize food chains by thinking of, well, how much of a tertiary consumer can be supported by how much of a secondary consumer, and how much stuff does that need to eat of the primary consumer, and what's the massive biomass of the producer that has to support it all, because it gets less and less. So that brings us to our next thing, where we try and represent that a bit more clearly using ecological pyramids. So if I start off with a food chain in the middle here, and if I start off with a rose bush, and we say that this rose bush is covered in aphids. Aphids are the tiny little green fly. I'm sure you've seen them in the garden. And aphids love to munch away at the rosebush leaves. Now, aphids get eaten by ladybirds. So ladybirds, therefore, must be a secondary consumer, because they've got the primary consumer as the rosebushes, secondary consumer, producer as the rosebush, primary consumers, the aphids, secondary consumers, the ladybirds, and something that loves eating ladybirds are magpies. You might often see magpies near a rosebush or perching it, pecking at it. They might be pecking off ladybirds that are on there, which is not good because you kind of want the ladybirds on the rose bushes to eat the aphids, so the aphids don't eat your rose bushes, because it's the rose bushes that you want growing in your garden. So you might want to scare the magpies away if they're coming at your roses. But if we're trying to represent those in terms of numbers and in terms of biomass, we can consider a pyramid of number first. So if we say there's one rose bush, and you'll notice that very thin line next to one rose bush, that thin line is representing that one rose bush. Now aphids are tiny, so actually on one rose bush you might get about 50,000 aphids. So we can do a much bigger, chunkier bar to represent the aphids. This is a bit like a graph, but kind of flipped on its side. So we've got a huge long line, but even so, 50,000 relative to that thin line of one is still going to be way larger. I wouldn't get it on my page at that scale. So I'm just going to add a couple of dashed lines to show that that should be much bigger, but at the scale I've got here, I just can't fit it on. Okay, those 50,000 aphids might be predated on, as in the ladybird is the predator of the aphid, by 250 ladybirds. So trying to keep the scale roughly there, 250 ladybirds is a much smaller bar. And 250 ladybirds might keep one magpie happy. It's pecking away at them. So that is a pyramid of number. It's just a kind of pyramid that shows you the rough numbers in each. Stupid name that it's a pyramid, because that's clearly not a pyramid. It would fall over because it's based on one on the bottom. But you think how different that pyramid might look if it was grass, rabbits and a fox, because it might be 1,000 grass plants feeding 20 rabbits, feeding 2 foxes. So it would then be more of a pyramid shape. But in this instance, it's only one rose bush. Okay, think if it was one oak tree, and on that oak tree was 1 million caterpillars, and those 1 million caterpillars being eaten by 50 blackbirds. That's going to be all over the place. Okay, so it doesn't have to be pyramid shaped, but it's much more useful to not think about the numbers and to standardize it by the amount of cells. How many rosebud cells need to go and support how many aphid cells, what amount of cells, and what amount of ladybird cells can be supplied by that, and what amount of magpie cells. And when we're talking about cells and the amount, we're talking about biomass, the mass of biological material. And that allows us to come up with a pyramid of biomass, which is much more useful, much more informative than a pyramid of number. So if the rose bush weighs 10 kilograms, then I can put a bar above me here saying 10 kilogram biomass of rose bush. Now what can that support in terms of aphids? Well, if each aphid weighs 0.05 grams, they're very small, and we've said we've got 50,000 of them. Well, 50,000 times 0.05 gives you 2.5 kilograms of aphids, which you can see above my head marked on here now. So a 10 kilogram rosebush could support 2.5 kilos of aphids. Now, if each ladybird weighs 2 grams, and there's 250 of them, well, 250 times 2 grams, that gives us 500 grams of ladybirds, or half a kilo of ladybirds. So that's how much ladybird material can survive on 2.5 kilograms of aphid material. And 2.5 kilograms of aphid material require 10 kilograms biomass of a rosebush to survive. And then if we consider that one magpie, smallish magpie, weighs 450 grams, we can put that on top and we get something that looks like this above me. Okay, so we get something much more regular, pyramid shaped. Now all pyramids of biomass do look much more pyramid shaped like this. So pyramids of biomass are always proper pyramid shape because the energy lost between trophic levels. You think to the last slide, because lots of energy got lost from one layer to the next, that layer must be a lot bigger to allow some of that biomass to not be eaten, to be eaten but not digested, and then to be respired. That's what provides for the next level, and then so on and so on. So a pyramid of biomass is much more useful, much more representative, and gives a good idea of how much stuff is required at each level within an ecosystem. So hopefully that was pretty straightforward. It should all be stuff you've covered further down the school. But continue on now with the same sort of feeding relationships topics and go to Ecology 2, which looks mostly at the predator-prey relationship, which is a very complex, subtle interaction between the predator and the thing that it eats, its prey. So head there now. There should be a link appearing over on the opposite side. And as always, if you've enjoyed this, if you want to get updates from me, subscribe to my channel, please. There should be a little circle with my face in it appearing here, and like this video if it was useful. Thank you.